Hey, what's going on, guys? We are talking October bass fishing today. October is almost here. Here in the North Country, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Canada, October basically is our transition from summer patterns all the way into winter patterns in 1 month. It happens really fast, but it does trigger some of the best fishing of the year for largemouth and smallmouth both, and they both typically are changing over from crayfish patterns to baitfish patterns, and they get really aggressive. They start chasing fast moving bigger baits, and it's an absolute blast to catch bass this time of year. So we're going to move through the periods early, mid, and late October, and we're going to talk about largemouth and smallmouth both, and then stick around to the end because I'm also going to cover that November time period for you hardcore guys who are going to stick it out till the very end. So with that, let's get started with early October. So here in Wisconsin and probably most other places where we have a really typical northern fall, early October is going to be very much like your late summer patterns with a few changes. So a lot of times what's going to happen is the bass are going to start moving a little bit shallower, and they're going to start pushing bait fish up shallow again, especially largemouth. A lot of times I've seen largemouth pushing bluegills straight up almost to the bank in early October, and basically just pinning them to the bank and just tearing them apart. And it's a great time of year as those weeds start to thin and drop back a little bit to fish really shallow for largemouth. And you want to use bait fish imitations. So for this area, bluegill's a huge forage base in most of our lakes, and bass eat a ton of them. So I'm throwing paddle tails with bluegill colors like the Largo shad. I'm throwing swim jigs and green pumpkin, and oftentimes I'm dipping the tail of that swim bait in chartreuse dip and glow, because if you've ever seen bluegills swimming in the shallows, you'll see they have a chartreuse looking tail on them, especially the small ones, and that's a great way to imitate those bluegills. If you throw a swim jig green pumpkin with that chartreuse tail up shallow, you'll see it swims just like a real bluegill, and it crushes bass. So you can also throw topwater. So both for largemouth and smallmouth, this is one of my favorite times of year to throw topwater. They're pushing bait up shallow, and they're crashing on it a lot of times, and you can really trigger them with either a prop bait or a popper or a walking bait, and it can really be effective this time of year and an absolute blast. Now, kind of transitioning into smallmouth, in early October, again, they're starting to kind of move away from those crayfish patterns. A lot of times what I see is them chasing shiners still around those rock to weed transitions a lot of times, but typically against a bank. So, you know, a lot of times in the summertime we're fishing offshore structure. We're going to start transitioning to banks, because what they're going to do is they're going to push that bait up against the bank and pin it there so it can't escape. If you've got an open, you know, hump out there, they can just swim over the top and get away, but they like to have something to actually push those bait fish up against. So again, moving baits, you know, a little smaller swim baits for the smallies, like 3-inch or 4-inch. A crankbait. A crankbait is a great way to catch early October smallies and largemouth too, but especially smallmouth where they've got bait fish pinned up against rocky areas. You can throw that crankbait up shallow, start bouncing it down through the rocks, and then as it comes off the rocks, give it a few twitches, and I mean, they just crank that thing. It's probably my favorite time of year to throw a crank for smallies for sure. And you can start throwing some stick baits if the water's cool enough too, you know, but typically that's kind of a little bit later. So now moving on to mid-October. Similar pattern or similar baits we're going to be using, but what we're going to do is we're going to move deeper. The reason is the temps are starting to drop. You're starting to get some frosty mornings, and those bait fish are going to push out of the super shallow water, and they're going to get in that more stable mid-depth water on the edge of those weeds. Again, paddle tails are a staple for me all fall, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start weighting them heavier, and I'm going to start using bigger paddle tails. A lot of times mid-October the bass start to transition to larger forage. You want to match that and start upsizing your swim baits. Oftentimes I'm throwing 5 or 6 inch now for largemouth. Now oftentimes what I'll do, if I'm fishing deeper weeds and they're real thick, I'm going to actually put a 7/0 weedless weighted swim bait hook on, but I'm also going to peg a 1/2 ounce tungsten weight on the front of that bait so I can get it deeper because I still want it to move fairly fast, but I want it down towards the bottom of those weeds on that weed edge. So I want to be able to retrieve it fairly quickly without it coming up. And that allows me, you know, with more like 3/4 ounce of weight to really burn that bait along those deeper weed lines. And then you can use a heavier jig head as well, you know, more like a 1/2 ounce, and start fishing those deeper weed edges. Now we're still also going to use swim jigs a lot, and swim jigs, we're going to start upsizing the weight on those to more up to those 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce sizes. Trailers, I like to also scale back my trailer to get that bait down. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll actually put a craw trailer on and I'll rig it vertical so the appendages are this way. And one of my favorites for this would be the Crush City cleanup craw. It swims awesome, just those tails kick, but it's not as much surface area, so you can get that bait deeper in the water. And again, I'm still going to dip those tails in Dip and Glow to make them look like a bluegill. So the smallies, I'm also going to start transitioning to weeds. The reason is they're going to start feeding on bluegills and perch, and a lot of times they've been in the weeds all summer. Those weeds start to die back, and those perch and bluegills are starting to get kind of exposed. And the smallmouth are pretty much off the rocks right now. They're not using crayfish, so they're going to start hammering those edges of those weeds. And October is when I've caught some of my biggest, including my PB smallmouth, on weed edges. And oftentimes it's isolated weeds for smallies. If you've got rock on either side in an isolated patch, that's a great place to start. And big swim baits, again, like more like 4-inch for the smallmouth. Even 5-inch sometimes are great. Crankbaits still work. If the water's cool enough, you can start throwing a jerk bait, a deeper jerk bait, like a deep shadow wrap or something like that, that's going to get down like 8 feet. And that's a great way to fish October, mid-October for those smallies, is look for those bait fish around the weeds, and you can get some really big fish this time of year. Alright guys, all this talk about swim jigs reminds me I actually have to order some right now, because I got bit off by pike hardcore the last time I fished and I lost like 4 or 5. So I know you guys have heard me talk about the Omnia app for the insane mapping capabilities, but if you're a pro member and you have that mapping, you also have access to all the shopping features. So I'm going to open my Omnia app, and I get free shipping, no minimum, and I get also same day shipping. So if I order, it's going to ship today, and I also get 10% off every single order that I order from Omnia Fishing. So I'm just going to open it up here. It's super quick. I'm going to hit bass lures, jigs, scroll over to swim jigs, and then I'm going to scroll down and find my all-terrain tackle AT swim jig, and I'm going to pick out a couple 1/2 ouncers here, add to cart. Okay, perfect, added to cart. Now I'm going to hit checkout. Everything's set up with my credit card. All I have to do is check out, and no minimum. So now those swim jigs are going to show up at my door, and I didn't pay any shipping. They shipped them the same day I ordered them. So as I'm fishing, I can literally be ordering stuff that I need, and it takes me literally seconds, and I don't have to worry about whether or not they're charging me for each single thing. That I could order one thing every hour, and they're not going to charge me any shipping. There's no minimum. So super convenient if you're wanting to make sure that you're stocked up on everything. So with that said, let's move into that 3rd week of October. So moving into late October. Late October is typically that transition into the winter or late fall periods, and it's when we got to start slowing down. The fish are still going to be in the same areas a lot of times. A lot of times the largemouth are going to be on those deep weed edges, and the weeds are really dying out now, so those bait fish are super exposed, but the bass and everything's slowing down. So I'm going to lighten up my jigs, and I'm just going to fish slower. And oftentimes it's just a rise fall, lift fall with a paddle tail. Oftentimes I'll start to scale down again in size. I'm not going to be using those 5-6 inchers. I'm going to be using more like a 3 or 4, and just letting that paddle tail kick up and back down, up and back down. And you can start to kind of go back to more of those worm patterns too, like a shaky head or a Ned rig. Those start to work again as the temps drop. And then smallies oftentimes are going to move back to the rocks late October, and you can catch them on like a straight tail minnow on a smaller jig head. You can catch them on a jerk bait again. Oftentimes very similar to spring, you get those mid 50s to low 50s temps. and you start to catch them on jerk baits pretty good again up on those rock humps, and that's a fun way to catch smallmouth, big smallmouth in late fall. And also you can start kind of transitioning back to some of those bottom baits like the Ned rigs and the craw baits. They start to work again on deeper humps, especially in point extensions. And again, swim jigs still work. I'm just gonna lighten up the weight a little bit and just slow roll those things along the weed edges. So many things to talk about for October bass. Everything's just changing through the whole month, but that pretty much sums up your early, mid, and late October time periods. So before I get into that November transition, like I promised, thanks guys for watching. Please go subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate every single subscriber. And if you're gonna order anything that I've talked about in this video, make sure that you buy it through the links below in the description, because I do get a little commission for that. That helps me and my family, helps me to keep doing what I'm doing here, so I appreciate that as well. And so now let's move into November. So November is basically pretty much winter. So the spots you find bass under the ice is where you're gonna find them in November. Again, very slow moving baits. Oftentimes I'm going back to drop shotting. I'm going back to really lightweight jig heads with small straight tail minnows on them and just working them right over the top of fish. Downsizing, working weed edges really slowly with a paddle tail or a straight tail worm. Just a slow lift and fall with a few twitches right along the edge of those weeds. They're still eating bait fish quite a bit, so I want to stay on those bait fish patterns, but I'm just going to use slower presentations. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate every one of you, and I'm going to leave another video here for you to watch. We'll catch you later. Get hooked up.